young girl, poised, focused, her chin lifted with quiet confidence. And then she turns. Robert's breath stops. His world shifts. Not gradually, not gently, all at once. The shape of her face. Her expression carries something else too. A gentleness he once knew, a softness he once loved. She looks like Audra Konopelski, and she looks like him. Robert's heartbeat thunders in his ears. He tries to reason with himself. Coincidence, imagination, a trick of the light. But as the girl speaks her first line, her voice carries a tone so familiar it sends a cold wave across his skin. The applause swells around him. Parents cheer, cameras flash. But Robert hears none of it. He can only see her, only feel the truth slamming into him. Sharp, undeniable, impossible to outrun. This child, this brave little actress standing under the lights, is carrying a face he knows too well. And nothing in his life has ever shaken him the way she just did. Have you ever walked away from someone you cared about, convinced it was the right thing, only to discover that the cost of that decision was far heavier than you expected? Most of us have experienced a moment like that, a moment that forces us to look inward and question our past, a moment that leaves us wondering, what else have I missed? What else have I misunderstood? What have my choices truly cost me? That is the space Robert now finds himself in. One glance at the girl on stage shattered years of certainty. One moment forced him to reconsider everything he walked away from, and the truth he is facing tonight is only just beginning to surface. Robert Sanford is watching a child he has never met. At least, that's what he believes. But something inside him knows better. Something tightens in his chest. Not fear, not confusion. Something deeper, recognition. The girl on stage moves with a familiar grace. Her expressions mirror someone he once loved more than his own ambition. Her eyes reflect a history she shouldn't have, yet somehow does. She isn't just another student in a school performance. She is a reminder, a mirror, a consequence, a truth he never expected to face, because she isn't a stranger at all. She is the daughter he never knew existed, a child who grew up without his voice, without his presence, without his name, and somewhere behind the curtains, Audra Konopelski stands frozen, breath shallow, pulse racing, watching Robert's reaction from the shadows. She had always hoped this moment would never come. She had tried to protect her children from this exact collision of past and present. But there is no turning back now. Robert sees the child, Audra sees Robert, and both understand in the same heartbeat that the truth they have avoided for years has finally stepped into the open. Nothing will remain the same after tonight. What happens next will change every life connected to that stage. Robert doesn't know how this night will end. He doesn't know what truths will be spoken, what apologies will rise, or what wounds will reopen. He doesn't know whether this moment will lead to healing, or break what little remains of the past. But one thing is certain, by the time the final curtain falls, he will have to face everything he once ran from. He will have to face Audra. He will have to face the child on stage, the child who carries pieces of him in every feature. He will have to face the years he missed, the memories he never made, and the life that unfolded without him. He will have to decide whether to step forward or walk away again. And Audra, standing out of sight, hands clasped, heart pounding, knows she can't hide anymore. She has spent years protecting her children, shielding them from pain, shaping a life built on strength and quiet hope. But tonight, everything she feared is unfolding in front of her. What began as a simple school play is becoming the turning point of their lives. By the end of this story, you'll understand how this single night could rebuild a broken family, or tear it apart forever. Before the choices of the past collide with the realities of tonight, take a moment and support this channel. If you're already drawn into this moment, if you can feel the tension in this auditorium, the shift in Robert's chest, the quiet fear in Audra's breath, go ahead and hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories filled with emotion, depth, and powerful life lessons. And comment below, where are you watching from? Your comments help this community grow, and your support keeps these stories coming. Now, let's return to the stage. The spotlight is waiting. The truth is about to speak, and nothing can stop what comes next. Their marriage didn't break in a single moment. It fractured slowly, quietly, the way glass gathers thin lines long before anyone notices. In the beginning, Audra Konopelski and Robert Sanford were inseparable. She admired his determination, the way he carried entire companies on his shoulders without flinching. He admired her warmth, her devotion to her work, the steady calm she brought into his restless life. But over time, pressure crept into their home. Meetings dragged into the night. Calls interrupted meals. Robert started sleeping in his office more often than he admitted. Audra tried to hold the connection together, waiting up for him, planning moments they could share, sending reminders that she was still there. Each attempt faded into unanswered silence. Love still lived between them, but the weight of responsibilities pushed it deeper beneath the surface, where neither of them could reach it. The first real fracture arrived in a cold examination room. Audra sat at the edge of a padded table, her fingers laced tightly as Dr. Lillian Mercer delivered the words with careful sympathy. Pregnancy was not impossible, but it would be difficult, the kind of difficulty that shakes a marriage before anyone knows how to manage it. Audra cried later, quietly, in the privacy of their home. Not from weakness, but from the overwhelming grief of hearing a future she longed for become uncertain. She waited for Robert to sit beside her, to hold her, to remind her that they were a team. Instead, he fell silent, not cruel, not dismissive, just distant, lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with her pain. She reached for him, but he was already drifting somewhere she could no longer follow. Whispers followed Robert everywhere he went. Board members hinted at the need for a successor. Investors asked about long-term leadership. His aunt, Eleanor Sanford, emphasized the weight of continuing the family line. These pressures didn't arrive loudly. They built slowly, adding layer upon layer until they became too heavy to ignore. He carried that heaviness home. Though he never spoke of it directly, Audra felt it in every unfinished sentence, every glance that didn't linger, every evening he spent buried in work instead of resting beside her. She watched the man she loved retreat into himself, slipping into a world shaped by demands and expectations she couldn't compete with. She tried to reach him again and again, but each attempt met another barrier, his stress, his fear, his growing detachment. The house felt colder by the week, and Audra grieved the loss of a marriage that technically still existed, but emotionally had faded. It wasn't arguments that separated them. It was the silence between them, long meals without conversation, nights spent on opposite sides of the bed, days when they moved around each other like strangers sharing the same roof. Audra held onto memories of their early love, late-night conversations, shared laughter, mornings filled with softness and ease. Those memories felt out of reach now. Robert grew quieter, weighed down by worries he refused to voice. Audra felt herself fading into loneliness, unsure how to reconnect with a man who seemed to disappear emotionally even when he stood a few feet away. Nights together became nights apart. His warmth faded, replaced with polite gestures and practiced distance. Audra tried again and again to repair what was breaking, but every effort dissolved into the empty space between them. She still cared for him. She still hoped. But hope can only survive so long without oxygen. The evening he handed her the papers felt like stepping into someone else's life. There was no shouting, no accusations, just a stack of documents placed on the dining table with devastating simplicity. Audra stared at them, her breath caught between disbelief and heartache. "Is this because of the test results?" she asked softly. Robert didn't look at her. He kept his gaze lowered, unable to face the woman who had once been his source of comfort. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady. "It's better this way. No further explanation, no discussion, just an ending delivered in the calmest tone possible." Audra stood firm, even as her chest tightened, to keep from collapsing under the weight of it. She signed because fighting for someone who had already walked away felt like pouring love into a hollow space. She signed because she knew she couldn't keep holding a marriage alone. She packed lightly, a single suitcase, her medical books, a few personal items, the essentials of a life she once shared with him. Robert didn't ask her to reconsider. He didn't follow her to the door. He didn't stop her from walking away. The driver carried her bag, but Audra carried the memories, good and bad, that clung to her like a shadow. When she stepped outside, the air felt different, colder, almost acknowledging the quiet tragedy of what she was leaving behind. She kept her back straight and her gaze forward. Turning around would have broken her, and she didn't have the strength for that. With every step away from their home, she understood that endings do not always arrive with noise. Sometimes they come softly, leaving you unsure of the exact moment things truly fell apart. Rivermore waited for her, though she had no idea what that move would mean for her future. A new life, a new path, a chance to heal from wounds that had cut deeper than she realized. She wasn't just leaving a marriage, she was leaving behind a version of herself shaped by someone else's expectations and pressures. As the car pulled away, Audra rested her hand against the window and allowed one tear to fall, not out of defeat, but out of release, finally giving herself permission to feel everything she had held in for far too long. She didn't know it then, but this ending would lead her to a future filled with strength, purpose, and a love she never anticipated, the love she would hold for the 3 children she had not yet discovered she carried. Rivermore greeted Audra with quiet mornings, gentle waves, and a calm she had forgotten how to feel. She arrived with no plan except survival, no expectations, no promises, just a need to breathe without the heaviness that had lived in her chest for too long. The small rental apartment she found wasn't luxurious, but it was hers, a place untouched by memories of a marriage she wished she could release. The first few weeks tested her. She woke expecting to hear Robert moving in the next room, only to remember she was alone. She cooked for 1, sat at a table built for 2, walked through empty rooms that echoed only her own footsteps. But slowly, the emptiness became comforting. She built a new rhythm: early mornings, long study sessions, late-night reviewing of medical techniques. Her nights blurred into dawn as she poured herself into her training, refusing to let her past weaken her. Rivermore didn't heal her in one moment. It healed her through the details she once ignored. A welcoming nod from a cafe owner she visited after shifts, the soft sound of waves outside the window of her modest apartment, the quiet peace of falling asleep without fear of another tense evening. She rediscovered small joys she had forgotten existed. After years of emotional strain, stillness felt like a gift. Her career quickly became her anchor. She volunteered for the toughest assignments, stayed late, practiced until her muscles ached and her mind was sharp enough to drown out painful memories. Supervisors praised her skill, her composure, and her natural ability to steady a room during emergencies. For the first time in years, she felt whole in a way that had nothing to do with her relationship or anyone else's approval. The operating room became the one place where everything made sense. Inside those walls, the past didn't weigh her down. There were no unspoken expectations, no long silences, just precision and purpose. The more she worked, the more she rediscovered herself. The grief from her old life didn't vanish, but it softened, no longer defining her. For the first time in a long time, she built hope from her own strength. Still, some wounds lived quietly inside her, the diagnosis that had broken her marriage. She tried to ignore the memories, burying them under charts, lectures, and endless nights of study. But one morning, her body spoke a truth she couldn't ignore. She woke nauseous, dizzy, exhausted. It didn't feel like stress. It felt unfamiliar. She took a test with trembling hands, bracing herself for disappointment. The faint lines appeared slowly, then more clearly, then unmistakably. Pregnant, she collapsed to the bathroom floor, breath caught in her throat. Shock melted into joy, fear, confusion, emotion after emotion that left her trembling. The doctors had been wrong. Her body had accomplished what she had been told might never happen. It felt like a second chance she didn't dare believe in. But beneath the joy lived a quiet truth she could not escape. This child belonged to Robert as well. She sat for hours, trying to imagine the conversation she once dreamed of having with him. He would have lifted her into his arms, told her they would face anything together. But that version of their life was gone, replaced by a reality shaped by corporate demands and family pressure. She knew exactly what his relatives would do with this news. They would claim the child, they would dictate its life, they would tear away the future she wanted to build. She placed a hand on her belly and whispered, "You're safe with me," promising silently what she could never tell him. Months passed, and her growing stomach brought equal measures of anxiety and joy. She attended all her appointments alone, built plans for the future, and prepared to be a mother without leaning on anyone. Despite the challenges, each tiny kick reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. Her evenings became slow walks along the shoreline, letting the ocean ease her fears and steady her mind. She told no one who the father was, not her colleagues, not Dr. Lillian Mercer, who celebrated her progress with quiet pride, not May Redwood, who supported her during the later months of her pregnancy. The truth felt too fragile, too personal to share. She protected it fiercely. When labor came, she arrived at the hospital with steady breaths and a nervous smile, expecting one child, one miracle, one new beginning. But life had a different plan. Hours later, 3 tiny cries broke through the room. 3 newborns were placed against her chest, their small bodies warm and fragile. Brianna, Allison, Havey, triplets, born against every expectation, against every fear, against the diagnosis that once destroyed her marriage. She wept with joy and disbelief as she held them. All her pain, all her past heartbreak, felt distant, washed away by the overwhelming love she felt for the 3 lives she had brought into the world. They completed something inside her she didn't know was missing. Bringing them home opened a chapter she never expected to experience. Her apartment filled with soft whimpers, tiny hands reaching out, the sweet weight of 3 little heads resting against her chest. The nights were long, but the mornings were full of light, filled with smiles, tender moments, and the joy of watching them breathe peacefully in their sleep. Every bottle she prepared, every lullaby she whispered, every quiet hour spent holding them close reminded her that she had made the right choice. She kept them safe. She shielded them from a life shaped by pressure rather than affection. Sometimes she thought about Robert, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. Their paths had separated. His world moved forward without her, and hers expanded into something far more meaningful than anything they once shared. As she sat watching her children sleep, their small chests rising and falling with gentle rhythm, she promised them softly, "You will always be safe, you will always be loved, and you will always have me." She had no idea that fate was slowly stitching their worlds back together. No idea that one day Robert would stand face to face with the truth she protected. No idea how tightly the future was already pulling them toward a moment that would reshape everything. But tonight, in the quiet warmth of her tiny home, she held the only truth that mattered. Her children, her heart, her new beginning. Robert Sanford had everything a person could want: wealth, influence, company buildings bearing his name, and a reputation powerful enough to move entire markets. Yet after the divorce, his life felt hollow in a way he couldn't explain. He returned each night to a mansion that looked perfect from the outside but felt colder than any hotel room he had ever stayed in. The silence clung to the walls, settling into corners where laughter once lived. He noticed how empty the dining table had become, how untouched the kitchen felt, how quiet his evenings were without someone asking how his day went. The absence was unmistakable. He didn't admit it to anyone, but he missed Audra's voice, her encouragement, the calm presence she brought into every room she entered. At first he tried to distract himself with work, more meetings, more mergers, more responsibilities. He convinced himself that achievements could fill the space she left behind. But even as the numbers rose and boards applauded, the success felt strangely hollow. His accomplishments became noise in a world that lacked warmth. He traveled to conferences, spoke at events, posed for photos, but every hotel suite felt the same, sterile, quiet, lacking the comfort he once took for granted. Night after night, no matter the city or skyline outside his window, he felt the same weight pressing against his chest. He attempted dating again, encouraged by colleagues and acquaintances who insisted that moving on was healthy. The dinners were polite but empty, the conversations surface level. None of the women he met understood him beyond his status. None challenged him, none reached him. Every time he sat across from someone new, he found his mind drifting to Audra, her laugh, her steady confidence, the softness in her eyes when she looked at him without judgment. Compared to her, everything else felt muted, artificial, forgettable. As months passed, the regret he once buried began rising in quiet moments. He caught himself lingering in the garden, staring at the roses Audra planted during their first year of marriage. She tended to them with such care, humming softly under her breath. Now the blooms stood untouched, thriving despite the neglect, reminding him painfully of the woman who once nurtured their home with the same gentle devotion. He avoided that part of the property for weeks, unable to face how much of her still lived there. One evening he wandered into their old shared bedroom, a place he had avoided since the divorce. The faint scent of her perfume remained on the left side of the bed, trapped in memories he couldn't escape. He sat on the edge, elbows resting on his knees, and let the truth he denied for so long finally reach him. He realized he had traded companionship for expectations, love for pressure, a future with her for a legacy he wasn't even sure he wanted. He couldn't push the thoughts away anymore. He had let his fear of disappointing others drive the most devastating decision of his life. He replayed the moment he handed her the divorce papers more times than he cared to admit. Her expression, the mixture of hurt and dignity, haunted him. He remembered her quiet question, the way her voice trembled, and his failure to answer honestly. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that she deserved someone who wanted the same future she did. But deep down, he knew he hadn't been protecting her. He had been protecting himself from the expectations of a dynasty that never cared about the person he loved. The weight of loneliness grew heavier with each passing season. His mansion, once vibrant, became a space he simply slept in. His phone rang constantly during the day, yet his nights stretched endlessly in silence. He moved through life accomplished but incomplete, powerful but empty. He never spoke of it, but the ache of missing Audra settled into him like a shadow that refused to leave. It wasn't until one late night, standing alone in his office, staring at a photograph from years before, a picture of him and Audra laughing during a rare carefree moment, that he finally whispered the truth out loud. The room was quiet, the city lights glowing behind him, when the confession slipped free from a place he had kept locked. "I shouldn't have let you go." The words trembled in the air, honest and painful. He didn't know if speaking them changed anything, but acknowledging them felt like the first real moment of clarity he'd had in years. He realized that nothing he had gained could compare to what he lost. He missed her smile, her voice, the peace she brought him, peace he didn't know how to find on his own. Robert Sanford had everything, yet without Audra he had nothing that truly mattered. What he didn't know was that the life he once shared with her had continued in ways he could never have imagined. He didn't know that the future he believed he lost had grown quietly in another city. The future he once feared, the one he convinced himself he wasn't ready for. He didn't know that 3 small children existed who carried pieces of him in their faces, their laughs, their bright, curious eyes. He didn't know how close he was to discovering the truth that would change everything. Robert's collapse came without warning. One moment he was leading a high-stakes board meeting, standing at the head of a polished conference table. The next, his vision blurred and the room spun as if the floor had tilted beneath him. His hand gripped the table's edge, knuckles whitening, but it wasn't enough. Gasps erupted around him, chairs scraped back, the world dimmed as his knees gave out. The last thing he heard was someone shouting his name before everything went dark. The emergency team rushed him to the hospital, lights flickering overhead as he faded in and out of consciousness. Through the haze, he tried to make sense of the pain in his chest. Sharp, deep, unlike anything he had felt before. Voices echoed around him, too distant to grasp. Machines beeped nearby. When he finally lost awareness completely, fear gripped him in a rare moment of vulnerability. He had always believed he was in control. But now, control slipped through his fingers. When he woke again, it was in a dimly lit private room, the sterile scent of the hospital filling his senses. His assistant, Naomi Clark, stood nearby, worry etched into her voice as she explained what had happened. He had suffered a serious cardiac event. The condition was rare, difficult to treat, and required a highly skilled surgeon with advanced expertise. Robert listened silently, his chest aching, his mind foggy. He felt weaker than he ever had in his life. He asked her who had been assigned to handle his case. Naomi hesitated before answering, her expression softening in a way he had never seen. She held out his chart, and though she didn't speak immediately, the name printed at the top told him everything. Dr. Audra Konopelski. His breath halted. For a moment he wondered if the medication was affecting his vision, but he blinked, and the name remained. Audra. The woman he once promised a future. The woman he had pushed away. The woman whose absence he felt every morning and every night. She was the one responsible for his survival. A wave of emotions surged through him. Shock, disbelief, and something far more painful. The quiet realization that fate had placed his life in the hands of the person he least deserved help from. He swallowed hard, his heart pounding in a way he hoped wasn't dangerous. Naomi's voice broke through his thoughts as she confirmed what he could scarcely believe. She's the most qualified surgeon in the region, sir. The specialist everyone recommended. Her tone held no judgment, only truth. There was no avoiding this. No alternative. No way to detach the past from the present. Later that afternoon, while he lay recovering from the initial scare, his mind wandered to memories he had tried to bury. Audra, studying late into the night, her eyes bright with ambition, the way she spoke passionately about heart surgery, believing she could change lives with her hands. He remembered encouraging her once, telling her she had a gift. It was one of the few moments of their marriage untouched by tension or pressure. And now, years later, she was the one who had risen to the top of her field. She was the one standing between him and the worst outcome imaginable. The irony stung deep. He had walked away from her, believing he was making a logical choice, convinced they had no future together. Now she was the future he needed most. When the hospital staff explained the risks of his condition, he felt the weight of mortality press against him. His empire, his boardrooms, his endless responsibilities. None of it mattered in that moment. The only thought that echoed in his mind was her face, how she would look when she walked into the room, whether she still resented him, whether she would even speak to him beyond what professionalism required. His chest tightened, not from the condition but from dread he couldn't hide. As nurses adjusted machines and checked his vitals, he stared out the window, trying to calm the whirlwind inside him. Rivermore felt close and far all at once. For years, he had imagined what life might have looked like if things had unfolded differently. If he had fought harder, if he had believed in them, if he had allowed himself to choose love over legacy. Now time had brought him back to her in the most unexpected way. He wondered whether she would even want to save him, whether she could look at him without remembering the pain he caused, whether she had moved on, leaving him behind in a life she no longer wanted tied to her own. He didn't know what to expect when she finally entered the room. He only knew one thing with chilling certainty. If anyone could save him, it was Audra. And if she chose not to, if her hands hesitated for even a heartbeat, his future would vanish right there on the operating table. For the first time in his adult life, Robert felt fear, real, unfiltered fear, not of failure, not of losing his position, not of disappointing a legacy he never asked to carry, but fear of dying without ever facing the truth he had buried for so long. Fear of leaving the world without ever telling her what she once meant to him. He stared at the ceiling as the weight of that truth settled into him, quiet but undeniable. And somewhere down the hallway, unaware of the emotional storm waiting for her, Audra prepared to read the chart of a patient whose life she would soon hold in her hands, never expecting the name she was about to see. Audra walked into the consultation room expecting another patient in need of her expertise. She reviewed cases all morning, each one detailed, complex, and demanding full concentration. But the moment she lifted the chart in her hands and saw the name printed clearly across the top, her breath stopped. Her fingers tightened around the folder. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she had misread it, but the letters didn't change. Robert Sanford. The door was already closed behind her. The room was still. She stood in her white coat, her heartbeat loud in her ears, and forced her expression into calm professionalism. Years of training steadied her posture, but nothing could fully silence the storm rising inside her. She took one slow breath before lifting her gaze. Robert stood slowly from the chair, bracing a hand on the armrest as though unsure whether to sit or approach. The normally confident, unshakable man she remembered now looked uncertain, almost fragile. His eyes searched hers with a mixture of shock, guilt, and disbelief. It had been years since they last stood in the same room, yet the history between them filled every inch of space immediately. Audra. His voice cracked slightly, her name leaving his lips with an emotion he couldn't hide. She kept her grip firm on the clipboard. "Mr. Sanford," she answered, choosing the title with intention. Her tone was polite, neutral, untouched by the past. Her formal address made him flinch. He tried to compose himself, but the weight of regret sat heavily in his posture. "You're the surgeon?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I am," she replied. "I've gone over your scans. Your condition is serious but treatable. You'll need surgery within 10 days. He swallowed, the reality settling deeper. "And you're performing it?" "Yes," she said simply. "I'm the most qualified specialist available." The truth struck him harder than he expected. The woman he had once pushed away was now the one tasked with saving his life. He wanted to say something meaningful, something that acknowledged the gravity of the moment, but every thought tangled before reaching his tongue. He didn't know how to speak to her anymore. Audra, maintaining her professional rhythm, explained the details of the procedure, the risks, the recovery expectations. Her voice was steady, clinical, composed. But beneath her calm exterior, memories pressed against her chest, late nights spent studying beside him, the hopes they once shared, the pain that led her to walk away. Robert listened, though the words blurred. He focused on her face, on the strength she carried now, the confidence she once dreamed of having. She looked different, more grounded, more certain, more powerful. She had grown into the version of herself he always believed she could become. Seeing her like this made the sting of regret burn even sharper. When she finished reviewing his case, she closed the chart and stepped back slightly. "Do you have any questions?" she asked. He stared at her for a long moment, his voice low. "Are you all right?" Her expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "I'm your surgeon," she said softly. "That is what matters right now." He lowered his gaze, accepting the boundaries she placed between them. He never imagined a future where she would speak to him with such controlled distance. He never imagined seeing her again under circumstances like this. He certainly never imagined needing her in a way that left him exposed and vulnerable. As she turned to leave, he reached out instinctively, not grabbing her, but lightly brushing her hand with his fingertips. The contact was brief, unintentional, yet it jolted through both of them. She froze for a breath, her hand suspended between pulling away and staying still. The moment was small, but it carried years of unspoken emotion. She withdrew her hand gently but firmly. "You need rest," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He nodded, unable to speak. She reached for the door, her white coat shifting with the movement. Before she stepped out, he found his voice again. "Thank you for agreeing to help me." She paused, her back still turned. For a second he wondered if she would look at him, if she would say something that hinted at the woman she used to be with him. But she only replied with a steady, composed, "It's my job." Then she walked away, leaving him alone in the room with the weight of everything he had lost. Robert stared at the door long after it closed, feeling a hollowness in his chest that had nothing to do with his medical condition. He had survived countless challenges, built empires, faced down rivals without blinking. Yet standing across from Audra again, seeing what she had become without him, left him shaken in a way nothing else ever had. He feared the surgery, he feared the risks, but more than anything, he feared losing the chance to speak the truth he had buried for years. He feared leaving the world before he faced the woman he should never have let go. For Audra, walking down the hallway, the encounter stirred emotions she had tried to bury. She remembered the pain he caused, but she also remembered the man he once was, the man who believed in her dreams, the man she fell in love with. Seeing him vulnerable, weakened, and unsure cut deeper than she expected, but she pushed the emotions aside. Her responsibility was to save his life, nothing more. Yet neither of them realized that this reunion was only the beginning. Audra returned home later than usual, her body tired but her heart even heavier. She took a slow breath before unlocking the door, knowing exactly what she would see the moment she stepped inside. 3 pairs of small footsteps hurried toward her, each one eager, each one filled with pure joy that never failed to soften her exhaustion. "Mama!" Havy reached her first, arms lifted, eyes shining with excitement. She scooped him up instantly, holding him close, letting his warmth ease the lingering tension from the hospital. Allison tugged at her coat with impatient curiosity. "Did you fix someone's heart again?" Before Audra could answer, Brianna spoke from behind them, calm and observant as always. "You're late. We saved you some crackers." That was Brianna, gentle, thoughtful, wise beyond her years. Audra's tired smile deepened. "Thank you, sweetheart." For a moment, everything felt quiet and safe. But the image of Robert standing in that consultation room flashed in her mind, stealing her breath for a second. She had managed to remain composed while facing him, but the truth she carried suddenly felt heavier than ever. The triplets didn't know their father existed. They didn't know he had once been the center of their mother's world, nor that his absence shaped her life more than she ever admitted. And they didn't know that, earlier that day, she stood within an arm's reach of the man who unknowingly gave them their eyes, their smiles, their stubborn expressions. She pushed the thought aside and kissed the tops of their heads, breathing in the scent of home. Dinner was simple: pasta, fruit slices, and the crackers Brianna proudly saved. The triplets chatted with the excited energy only children possessed. Allison talked about her drawing of a castle. Avi explained how he found a shiny rock he was convinced was a treasure. Brianna quietly organized their plates, making sure everyone had equal portions. Audra watched them with a tender ache, knowing they were the reason she always kept moving forward. After dinner, she guided them through their nightly routine: bath time, pajamas, soft lullabies. But even as she sang to them, her thoughts drifted back to the hospital. Back to Robert's face when he saw her. Back to the way his voice cracked when he said her name. She sat on the edge of the bed as the children drifted to sleep. Brianna curled close to her side. Allison clutched her stuffed rabbit. Havy mumbled quietly before settling into soft breathing. The room's dim light highlighted their tiny features that mirrored the man who nearly changed her entire life today. A whisper escaped her before she could stop it. "What am I supposed to do now?" The children didn't answer. Their dreams were peaceful, untouched by the storm forming in her heart. When the triplets were finally asleep, Audra slipped into the living room. She sank into the couch, head resting in her hands. She tried to think logically, tried to separate the past from the present, but the truth refused to untangle itself. Robert didn't know. He had no idea they existed. No idea he had 3 children who carried his dimples, his expressions, his curious spark. 3 children who had never once asked about a father, because Audra raised them with enough love to fill every empty space. She thought she had years before the truth would matter, if it ever mattered at all. She believed she could keep their lives separate, keep their world small and protected. But the moment she stepped into his room at the hospital, life shifted without her permission. If he survived the surgery, which she would do everything in her power to ensure, he would still be part of her world whether she wanted it or not. Fate had already opened the door. She only feared what he might do if he discovered the truth. She imagined the questions he would ask. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep them from me? Why did you raise them alone?" The answers were complicated, painful, heavy. She didn't hide their existence out of vengeance. She didn't run from the truth to punish him. She left because he had already pulled himself away long before she walked out the door, because involving him meant involving a family that would see her children as assets, not people. Because she refused to let anyone treat her miracles like obligations. She didn't regret protecting them, but now, everything she preserved felt fragile. Audra leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if the quiet room could offer clarity. She pressed a hand to her chest, remembering the way Robert looked at her earlier, surprised, remorseful, afraid. She tried to ignore the tremor in her stomach, the one that came from old memories resurfacing without warning. She wasn't the same woman he once knew. She was stronger now, more certain, more willing to protect what mattered. But strength didn't erase fear, and Robert being back in her orbit was the one thing she never prepared for. Later that night, she checked on the children again. Brianna shifted slightly, her hand reaching toward her mother even in sleep. Allison whispered something incoherent before settling back down. Havy snored softly, sprawled across his little pillow. Audra brushed a strand of hair from Brianna's forehead and felt tears rise. Her heart tightened at the sight of them. So small, so perfect, so undeserving of the complications fate was putting in their path. She whispered, "I'll protect you, always." Her voice trembled with equal parts promise and fear. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep the truth hidden. She wasn't sure whether protecting them meant shielding them from Robert, or eventually letting them meet him, Uncertainty pressed against her chest, a silent battle she had no answers for. She forced herself to sit at the kitchen table with her laptop open, trying to distract herself with case notes and patient reports, but focus slipped away. Her mind returned to Robert again and again. The look in his eyes, the weakness in his voice, the way the room seemed to freeze between them. He was vulnerable. He needed someone he trusted, someone who knew what she was doing. She was that person whether she wanted to be or not. She hated that she still cared on some level. Not romantically, not longingly, but genuinely. She didn't want him to die. She didn't want her children to grow up with a story that began with loss they couldn't comprehend. She didn't want her past with him to end on a cold operating table. She closed her eyes with a slow exhale. Tomorrow would come, the surgery would come, the truth would come, and when it did, everything she built might shift again. As the night deepened, the house finally settled into full silence. Audra sat alone in the dim glow of the kitchen light, her thoughts tangled between past and present. She brushed her fingers lightly over the table's surface, grounding herself. She didn't know what decisions she would face soon. She didn't know how Robert would react to her success, her life, or the children he never knew existed. She didn't know if fate was giving them a warning or a second chance. But she knew one thing with certainty. No matter what happened next, she would stand her ground. For herself, for her heart, for the 3 little lives asleep in the next room. Everything else would have to wait. The morning of the operation felt almost ordinary at first. The steady buzz of fluorescent lights in the corridor, nurses trading concise updates, the soft click of shoe soles on tile. Outside, a cluster of reporters waited for any sign of news. But inside the surgical wing, the world narrowed to a corridor of doors and a single purpose. Audra arrived early, coat folded neatly over her arm, eyes clear and focused. She walked past the waiting area with practiced calm, aware of the camera she could not see and the rumors that would swirl whether she spoke or remained silent. Her team greeted her, Dr. Raymond Yu at her side, Naomi checking the latest labs, and for a moment the old life she'd known threatened to rearrange itself around the bright, sterile lights. She inhaled slowly, letting the steady rhythm of routine settle her. Today, she told herself, was about skill, nothing else. Memories brushed her unexpectedly as she scrubbed in. A laughter from years ago, a small hand in hers, the quiet conversations where they planned ordinary futures. None of those moments had prepared her for this. Still, she kept a protocol. The personal would not dictate the procedure. The oath she had taken demanded clarity above revenge, competence above the pull of old wounds. She positioned the instruments, checked the monitors, and listened to the hum of the room as if it were a metronome guiding every move. This was work that required absolute attention. Any falter could cost a life. She squared her shoulders and stepped into the theater not as the woman who had loved and left, but as the surgeon who had trained for moments just like this. Anesthesia drifted over the operating table like a pale fog, and when Robert's breathing softened, the team moved with the rehearsed choreography of countless previous operations. Retractors clicked, suction whispered, and the incision line opened the quiet like the turning of a page. Audra's hands were deliberate. No needless flourish, no theatrics, only precise, practiced motion. Dr. Raymond's voice was calm as he supplied instruments. Naomi adjusted displays. A scrub tech offered clamps with a steadying nod. Each person in the room belonged to the same mission. The patient at the center was human first, a body requiring repair. Professional care held the foreground, and Audra let its discipline steady the tide of whatever else swelled in her chest. Inside the chest, the sight was as clinical as any she'd seen. Tissue, vessels, the slow, stubborn motion of what kept a life going. But to Audra, it was also intimate in a way she had never expected to confront again. There was no drama in the anatomy, only the truth she'd learned to respect through years of practice. The heart was resilient and fragile at once. She worked steadily, isolating the diseased section with practiced expertise, tracing the path of damage with the kind of attention earned only by long hours and hard-won confidence. Her fingers stitched the language of repair, careful, patient, exact. Every decision was measured, which incision to widen, which artery to reroute, where reinforcement was necessary. When the rhythm of the work slowed, She felt the quiet gratitude of competence wash through her. This was what she did best, and she would not fail now. Halfway through, a complication arrived, not in spectacle, but as a subtle escalation, unexpected bleeding from a small vessel that threatened to cloud the field. Monitors ticked with new urgency. The room tightened around its protocols as everyone moved to counteract it. Audra's training took command. She called for suction, altered angles, tightened sutures. Her voice was crisp and calm, a conductor guiding the room through a brief, dangerous note. In that critical stretch, she made a choice that had nothing to do with the past. She held to the path of repair, of measured precision, refusing any impulse to let the operation become anything other than a life-saving act. Compassion, she realized, was not a matter of words here. It was the steady hand, the decision to do what the patient needed rather than what her old heart might have demanded. When the bleeding stilled and the last layers were sealed, the moment of repair felt less like an ending and more like a careful rebirth. The repaired tissue lay quiet beneath the sutures, closed and steady. Audra took a breath she hadn't noticed she was holding, and for a sliver of time an odd peace settled over the room. The instruments were set aside, the team began their routine closure, and the patient's vitals steadied into the safer range they had hoped for. She found herself watching the small rise and fall beneath the drape, a slow, steady motion that spoke of continuation. In that pause, she felt something shift inside her too, a loosening of a tension she had carried, not because the man across the table deserved release, but because she had chosen the path that allowed life to continue. Healing, she thought, often demands the quietest courage. By the time the anesthesia team took over and the final bandages were applied, exhaustion arrived like a gentle tide. Audra stepped out of her gloves and let the cool air of the recovery room touch her face. She had performed at the peak of her skill. She had not let the past direct her hands. A physician from intensive care updated her, and she reviewed the instructions for post-operative care with the same disciplined clarity she had used in the OR. When she finally allowed herself a private moment, she sat alone for a minute in a corridor, feeling the adrenaline ebb and the weight of what she'd accomplished settle into place. The hospital noises resumed around her, distant rolling carts, a radio murmuring in another wing, footsteps measured and purposeful. Life, in the ordinary sense, continued. Later, as staff wheeled the patient toward recovery and the day outside continued with its ordinary churn, Audra walked slowly back to the staff lounge. In the quiet of that small room, she allowed memory and relief to mingle for a breath, neither triumph nor vindication, just the sober recognition that she had chosen a profession that anchored her through the hardest of reckonings. The operation had closed one urgent chapter. It had opened questions that would not be answered on an operating table, but for now, the immediate work was done. She had healed a heart and, in the process, had begun to stitch parts of her own life toward a new shape, less about the past she had survived, more about the future she would face with steady hands. The world returned to Robert in fragments, a soft beeping, the low hum of machinery, the muted glow of hospital lights filtering through his eyelids. When he finally opened his eyes, his body felt heavy, as if sleep and pain and relief were tangled together beneath his skin. His chest ached, not sharply, but with the deep soreness of someone who had been pulled back from the edge. He blinked slowly, trying to piece together what had happened, and then he saw her. Audra sat beside his bed, her white coat draped over her scrubs, her hair pulled back in a tired knot. She looked calm, composed, focused on the chart in her hand. Yet something about the line of her shoulders revealed how long she had been there. Robert's breath caught in his throat. The room felt smaller with her in it, the history between them thick enough to be felt, but not spoken. "You're awake," she said quietly, lowering the chart. Her voice was steady, but there was a softness beneath it she didn't attempt to hide. He swallowed, his throat dry. "You saved me," she nodded. That was the goal. Her response was simple, professional, yet it carried weight. The person he had once broken, emotionally, unintentionally, regretfully, had been the one to keep him alive. He searched her face for anger or resentment, but her expression revealed nothing beyond concern for her patient. After a few beats of silence, he tried again. "Audra, I meant what I said before the surgery," but she held up a hand gently. "You need to rest. That conversation can wait." The room felt too quiet after she spoke, as if her words settled into the air and left no space for anything else. Robert shifted slightly, testing his strength, wincing at the tug in his chest. But the discomfort only reminded him of the truth. He was alive because she willed it. Because she stepped into that operating room despite everything he had once put her through. He watched her check his monitors with the precision he remembered from the woman who studied late, into the night while he worked beside her. She had always been meticulous, always devoted to her patients. Seeing her now, stronger, more assured, confident in ways he once hoped she'd become, stirred something inside him. "Why are you still here?" he asked softly. She didn't look at him right away. "I always stay until the patient wakes. It's standard." He knew she was avoiding the truth. This wasn't standard. He had seen recovery rooms before. Surgeons didn't linger at bedsides unless something compelled them to. He wanted to ask if she had been worried, if she felt anything at all when she saw him unconscious on the table. But he held the questions back. Pushing her now, especially in this state, felt selfish. Her gaze finally met his. "Your vitals are stable. That's what matters." He studied the lines of her face, searching for traces of the woman he once knew so intimately. He found pieces of her, the compassion, the seriousness, but woven with a strength she never used to show. Years had shaped her, life had sharpened her, and he felt the consequences of his choices like a bruise on his chest. "You've changed," he murmured. She didn't deny it. Life tends to do that. As she made her notes, he couldn't tear his eyes away. The way she held the pen, the steady movements of her hands, the quiet focus she brought to everything she touched. He remembered those hands resting on his shoulders during late nights, remembered them brushing against his cheek during softer days, remembered how safe he once felt with her without realizing how rare that safety was. "I'm sorry," he whispered suddenly, unable to keep it contained any longer. She paused, but she didn't look up. "This isn't the time for apologies." "Then when?" His voice cracked more from emotion than from pain. "I've waited years to say it." Her pen stilled. The air shifted between them. She set the chart aside and sat back in her chair, hands folded in her lap as she regarded him with a calm he hadn't expected. "Robert, we're not doing this right now," she said gently. "You just came out of major surgery. Your heart needs time. Your body needs time. And She exhaled slowly. "I'm still figuring out what I need." He wanted to argue, to tell her that he didn't care about his own recovery as much as he cared about finally admitting the truth to her. But he saw the steadiness in her eyes, the boundary she wasn't willing to break, and he knew he couldn't push past it. Minutes passed in soft quiet, broken only by the soft hum of machines. Audra stood to check the 4 lines and adjust the blanket over him. Her movements were gentle, careful in a way that stirred old memories. Despite her distance, she still cared. That truth hit him harder than he expected. "Do you hate me?" he asked, the question escaping before he could take it back. Her hands froze. She didn't turn immediately. When she finally faced him, her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It held something far more complicated. "I don't hate you," she said, voice steady. "Hate would mean I'm still tied to the hurt you caused. I've moved forward." Her words were honest, and they stung, not because she no longer loved him, but because he realized how much she had changed while he remained trapped in the past. "You didn't deserve what happened," he whispered. "Neither of us did," she answered softly. A faint tremor passed through her, one she quickly suppressed. She stepped back, distancing herself physically, even if emotionally she still hovered in the space between past and present. "You'll need close monitoring for the next several days," she continued, redirecting back to the role she felt safest in. "I'll oversee your recovery, but after that, whatever conversations we need to have will happen outside the hospital." Her tone was gentle but firm, professional boundaries wrapped around unresolved history. "Thank you," he murmured. Not just for the surgery, but for staying, for speaking to him, for letting him see the version of her he had always hoped she would grow into. She picked up her chart again. "Get some rest. I'll check on you later." As she walked toward the door, he watched her, not with longing, but with the heavy realization that he might be too late to repair what he broke. He closed his eyes when she left, but sleep didn't come. The ache in his chest wasn't just from the incision. It was from the truth he now understood fully. He lost the woman who once loved him because he failed to cherish her when he had the chance. Audra stood outside the door for a moment, her hand resting on the frame as her breath caught quietly. She had prepared for clinical distance, for calm professionalism, but seeing him vulnerable, grateful, and apologetic had unsettled something deep inside her. She wasn't ready for what came next. She wasn't sure she ever would be. But fate had already begun the work. Their worlds were no longer separate, and whether either of them wanted it or not, the next chapter would force them to face the truth neither had spoken aloud. Everything was shifting again. Robert's recovery was steady, not miraculous. Each day the monitors told a quieter story. Stable vitals, better circulation, steadier breaths. Where panic had once lived in his chest, small habits began to replace the emptiness. He took his medicine on time, walked the short corridor with measured steps, and listened to the nurse's instructions without the old impatience. People noticed the shift. His assistant paused less between questions. Board calls were shorter, more focused, but the real change showed up in the tiny things no one else witnessed. He called to check on the house gardener. He left a thank you note for a chef who had prepared a bland recovery meal. He sat for longer at the window, gazing at the roses Audra had planted years before, not with contempt but with a gentle nostalgia that softened the sharp edges of his memories. Audra watched these small transformations with the wary attention of someone who had learned to read an old, complicated book. She saw him in the waiting area one afternoon, hands folded, answering a nurse's question with an apology and a straight look. It was nothing dramatic, no public confession, no tearful declarations, just measured humility. The sight unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. Part of her wanted to flinch and retreat into the safety she'd built with her children. Another part registered the rare human truth of regret unfolding in front of her and had to acknowledge it. She reminded herself to stay professional, to keep the boundaries she had set, but when she caught his eye and he offered a small, honest smile, something in her chest softened, cautiously, like a shutter opening a sliver to light. Their interactions grew quieter, briefer, but richer with meaning. Meetings that once felt clinical now contained moments that hovered between past and present, a shared silence in a corridor, both glancing at a framed surgical commendation she had earned, a pause where they both laughed, unexpectedly, over some absurd hospital policy. He started asking precise questions about the recovery process, rather than about paperwork, about pain levels, physical therapy, the smallest comforts a convalescent needed to feel human. She answered without theatrics, and he listened as if the words themselves might map a path back to something he'd lost. Each exchange chipped away at a mutual armor they had worn for years, careful, protective, effective, until they discovered that the space between them could hold more than accusation or history. It could hold small, honest connection. He attempted restitution in practical, steady ways rather than grand gestures. He reached out to ensure Audra's team had lunch during a particularly long shift. He quietly arranged for some much-needed equipment to be replaced in the pediatric ward. No announcement, no press release, just done. He apologized to staff members he had once overlooked, acknowledging their names, their efforts. These acts did not rewrite the past, but they signaled a man who had begun to measure value differently, who had learned that power without compassion was a brittle thing. Audra noticed these changes not because they were flashy, but because they were sincere. The repetition of small, unremarkable kindnesses built a new pattern where the old one had been torn. Between checkups, they found themselves sharing a few private moments that altered how each remembered the other. On one late afternoon, while reviewing post-op notes, Audra mentioned a book on pediatric care she'd found helpful. He took note and, weeks later, left a copy tucked into her locker with a short note, "For the work that changes lives." It was simple, unadorned, and it made her laugh out loud in a way that startled her. Those gestures mattered because they were unexpected and unpressured. They hinted at a future where actions, not words, might speak the truest language between them. For him, offering those small tokens felt like making amends without asking for permission to be forgiven. For her, receiving them asked nothing but quiet acceptance or refusal, and she did not have to decide immediately. As the days turned, the triplets began to sense a shift too, though they had no words for it. Brianna noticed how Robert's smile softened when he watched a puppet show at the hospital's child wing and tugged at Audra's sleeve as if to point it out. Allison drew a picture of a man with kind eyes and labeled it friend, then proudly showed it to her mother. Havy, always the curious one, tried to copy Robert's careful gait as he practiced walking with a nurse, then burst into giggles when he nearly tripped. The children's acceptance was uncalculated. It unfolded like sunlight across the floor, gentle, patient, and entirely present. Audra watched them, heart clenched and warmed at once, realizing that whatever decisions lay ahead would have to reckon with the quiet ways her children were already forming impressions of the man at the center of their story. For Robert, the change wasn't painless. He wrestled with guilt that arrived in waves, sharp on good days, dull on others. He replayed lost moments and imagined ones he had missed with his children. He often left the hospital to stand by the roses, tracing petals with a careful fingertip, thinking about how different his life might have been if he'd chosen differently. Yet he also began to accept that regret, when moved into action, could become a kind of work. He did not demand mercy. He offered consistency. He sat through training sessions to learn how to help with the simplest baby tasks, asking Audra cautious questions about schedules and favorite lullabies. Those conversations were awkward at first, hesitant and clumsy, but sincerity lent them weight. Audra kept her guard up in the ways that mattered most. She refused to let haste decide a future she would share with her children. She insisted on honesty and boundaries, insisting that any involvement be gradual and respectful of the life she had built. Still, she found herself listening for the sound of his footsteps in the parking lot, waiting to see whether the man who had returned would choose presence over pride. Both of them were learning to move differently. He, to show up without demanding credit. She, to see without yielding everything she had fought to protect. The slow, quiet work of rebuilding had begun, and when they met in that delicate space between apology and trust, they realized the road ahead would not be easy. But it might lead somewhere neither had expected, and both, in small, reluctant ways, were willing to try. Audra woke to murmurs before sunrise, small voices weaving through the thin walls of the apartment, each one already awake and impatient for the day's small adventures. She padded into the children's room and found Brianna sitting upright, knees tucked, reading a picture book by the faint glow of a nightlight. Allison was tracing invisible maps on the blanket, already plotting an expedition to the backyard. Havy stood wobbling with a stuffed bear clutched to his chest, eyes bright and ready for mischief. She smiled despite herself, feeling the soft tug of morning routine settle around her like a familiar shawl. The work of motherhood was relentless and ordinary, and she had learned to take comfort in its regularity. Breakfasts were prepared, little shoes laced, stories exchanged, and soon the apartment hummed with the cheerful energy of three small people who believed each day held promise. During the short walk to the clinic that morning, Brianna held her mother's hand and asked about the doctor who had written Audra's name on a paper she once saw at work. "Mama, why do people say you save people's hearts?" she inquired, with the pure curiosity only a child could muster. Audra crouched to be level with her daughter and brushed a loose curl from Brianna's forehead. "Because I help fix the parts that hurt inside people," she said simply. The answer satisfied Brianna's wide eyes, and they continued, her voice folded into the ordinary cadence of their day. At the hospital, the children were a small splash of life, in a place often measured by sterile routines. May Redwood watched them with indulgent smiles when they visited the pediatric wing, letting them press stickers onto charts and parade tiny drawings down the hallway. Audra observed these moments with a protective pride. She had built this world for them, piece by careful piece, and the sight of their ease warmed her. Yet behind the comfort, a low, constant worry creased her thoughts. What would happen if Robert learned of them? How would his influence ripple through the quiet life she had constructed? She caught herself measuring every gesture, every word, as if some misstep could invite problems she had carefully kept at bay. The fear was not about confrontation so much as about losing the fragile autonomy she had carved out for her children and herself. At home that afternoon, the children tumbled around her living room in a happy chaos of blocks and crayon marks. Allison declared herself queen of a castle made from cushions. Havy attempted to stack towers that toppled with delighted squeals. Brianna aligned toy animals in meticulous rows, narrating their tiny lives with the solemnity of someone who noticed everything. Audra watched, thinking about the faces they might one day have to reconcile, faces that carried a lineage neither wholly hers nor wholly absent. She felt a fierce swell of protectiveness. They were small now, and she wanted their world to remain uncomplicated for as long as possible. Their bedtime conversation that night took a softer, more thoughtful turn. Brianna, with that adult patience she often adopted, asked, "Mama, do we have any family who lives far away?" The question was simple, but it held the gravity of curiosity in small hands. Audra hesitated, tasting the rightness of partial truths. "We have the family we've made," she said finally, choosing words like gentle stones to place in a stream. "And we are safe. That will never change." Avie snuffled and mumbled about a missing sock, and Allison burst into a giggle that chased away the weight of the moment. Audra tucked them in, smoothing blankets and pressing kisses to foreheads that smelled of lavender and laundry soap. Each tender motion reaffirmed the promise she had made at their births to be their shelter. Still, the seed of uncertainty lingered. Audra found it rising in private hours, a question that nudged against the edges of her resolve. When the time came to decide what truth to share, how would she weigh the value of their right to know against the risk of altering their childhood? She had chosen secrecy to protect them from being treated like possessions, but as the children grew, so did the possibility that ignorance could one day feel like a loss rather than a shield. Outside influences slipped into their lives in small, cautious ways. Occasionally, a well-meaning colleague would offer baby clothes the children had outgrown, or a neighbor might stop by with a casserole. Audra accepted these gifts with gratitude, but also with the watchful eye of someone who had learned that generosity could hide expectations. She guarded their schedule, declined invitations that might expose them to prying eyes, and planned outings to quieter parks rather than crowded events. One afternoon, Brianna returned from a playdate with a new friend and described the boy's father with a detail that lodged under Audra's skin. "He has a funny pocket square, Mama. He looks very important." Audra listened, voice steady, and asked about the games they played. The surface of the conversation never cracked, but the ripple had been felt. Each casual comment from the outside world felt like a reminder that their small life existed within a larger one that might one day reach in. When the children slept, Audra often rose to the kitchen and stared into the darkness with a mug warming her hands. She let the quiet be a space to breathe and to reckon with the choices she had made. She did not regret them. How could she when every smile, every breath of her children proved the worth of the sacrifice? Yet she knew the future would demand decisions that could not be postponed forever. For now mornings brought simple joys and evenings gentle rituals. Laughter filled corners of the apartment where sadness once lingered. The 3 little hearts she held were anchors, reminding her why she stood firm when the world expected her to yield. She promised herself, once more, that she would choose carefully and fiercely for them. No one would treat them as anything less than whole. No one would reduce them to an asset. Not while she was here to keep watch. The moment Audra walked through the door that evening, she felt it. An atmosphere charged with something her children couldn't name but immediately sensed. Brianna's eyes tracked her movements with quiet curiosity. Allison paused mid-sentence, watching her mother with a tilt of the head. Avie tugged at her sleeve, sensing the shift with the instinct of a child who understood moods long before language. Audra tried to hide the weight she brought home from the hospital, but the children had been hers long enough to recognize when something tugged at her heart. She knelt to hug them, pulling each close, letting their warmth push away the cold echo of her earlier encounter with Robert. They didn't know the details, but they understood her in a way only children shaped by her presence could. While she prepared dinner, Brianna lingered at her side, tracing gentle circles on the counter with her finger. Allison hummed as she stacked cups, and Avie followed every small task like an apprentice trying to learn the world through watching his mother. Audra tried to focus on simple motions, chopping vegetables, stirring sauce, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the hospital room where Robert had awakened to find her beside him. She had kept her voice steady, her body composed, but afterward her chest felt tight, as if holding in too many truths at once. "Mama?" Brianna's small voice tugged her from her thoughts. "You look Thinking. Audra paused, surprised by how precisely her daughter articulated it. She wiped her hands on a towel and crouched to meet Brianna's steady gaze. I'm okay, sweetheart. Just a long day. Brianna studied her silently, dark lashes lowering as if weighing whether the answer felt complete. Then she leaned her head against Audra's shoulder without another word. The gesture nearly unraveled her. Audra wrapped her arms around her daughter, breathing in the calm that always seemed to radiate from the eldest child, the one who felt everything deeply without announcing it. After dinner, the triplets gathered their toys in the living room. Allison directed their play with the confidence of a child who saw the world as something she could rearrange. Havy followed with delighted chaos, knocking down block towers only to cheerfully rebuild them moments later. Brianna placed dolls in formation, creating tiny worlds with a care that mirrored her mother's precision. Audra sat nearby, watching them, letting their voices carry her thoughts to gentler places. Yet even in these warm moments, her mind drifted back to the hospital. She kept seeing the surprise in Robert's eyes when he woke, the vulnerability, the regret that had flickered beneath his attempt to stay composed. She didn't want her feelings to betray her, didn't want to acknowledge the part of her that still reacted, still softened, still felt echoes of the woman she used to be. She wished the past would stay buried, but fate had pulled it out of the earth the moment she opened that consultation room door. Later, she guided the triplets through their nighttime routine. Bath time punctuated with splashes and giggles, pajamas pulled over wriggling limbs, toothbrushes wielded like tiny weapons in a battle against bedtime. These moments grounded her as much as they exhausted her. She could control this world, shape it, protect it. Here, everything made sense. As she tucked Allison into bed, the little girl reached up and touched her cheek. "Mama," she whispered, "your eyes look heavy." Audra brushed a kiss to her forehead. "Because I'm tired, but not sad." Allison's voice dipped into seriousness in an instant. "No," Audra murmured, smoothing the blanket. "Not sad." The small girl accepted the answer with a nod, but the innocence in her eyes made Audra's chest tighten. She wasn't sad, not exactly. She was unsettled, conflicted, afraid of what the future might demand of her. When she reached Brianna's bed, the quiet child spoke without looking up. "Is your patient important?" The question was deliberate, spoken with the precision of thought that always set her apart. Audra froze. "Why do you think that?" "You look different when you came home," Brianna said simply, like you remembered something old. The words hit so close to truth that Audra couldn't speak for a moment. She stroked her daughter's hair gently, unable to lie but unwilling to burden her with truths she was too young to hold. "Someone from my past came back today," she said softly. "That's all?" Brianna nodded, her small fingers curling around Audra's wrist. "We're here," she whispered, as if she understood more than any 4-year-old should. When she tucked Havy in, he reached up with both arms, demanding his usual good-night hug. "Mama's safe," he mumbled sleepily into her shoulder. The simplicity of it made her eyes sting. She kissed his temple and held him just a little longer than usual. When the apartment finally quieted, Audra returned to the living room, sinking into the couch. The silence settled over her like a blanket, warm but weighted. Her fears began to whisper again, questions she tried desperately to ignore. If Robert discovered the truth about the children, what would he do? How would his world collide with theirs? How could she shield her family from complications that might tear apart the fragile life she'd built? She pressed her palms against her forehead, breathing deeply. She had chosen to raise her children alone because she believed it protected them, because she couldn't risk them becoming pawns in a life of obligations she had once escaped. She refused to let anyone treat Brianna, Allison, or Havy as symbols or assets. They deserved a life shaped by love, not status. A soft sound startled her, a tiny footstep. Brianna stood in the doorway, clutching her blanket, gaze solemn. "Mama," she whispered, "did someone hurt your heart today?" Audra exhaled slowly, moved by her daughter's intuition. "No, sweetheart," she said, opening her arms. "My heart is just remembering." Brianna climbed into her lap without hesitation, resting her head on Audra's chest. The two sat in silence, the quiet room filled with the soft rhythm of their breathing. Audra wrapped her arms around her daughter, grounding herself in the present, in the warmth she fought to preserve. She knew tomorrow would bring new decisions, new challenges, new truths she could no longer avoid. But for tonight, she held her child close and let herself believe that love, pure, simple, fierce, would be enough to face whatever came next. She whispered into Brianna's hair, a promise she needed to speak aloud. No matter what happens, I'll protect you, all of you, because that was the truth she could cling to. The one certainty she had left. Robert had insisted on gentle walks in the hospital garden once he was cleared for short outings, a small concession to reclaim a sense of normalcy. The garden smelled of damp earth and clipped roses, a place designed to steady anxious minds and soothe recovery. That afternoon, Audra had brought the triplets for a routine check at the pediatric clinic and allowed them a few minutes of play under May Redwood's watchful eye. She bent to tie Havy's shoelace, humming one of the lullabies she used at bedtime, when a voice she didn't expect called her name. She looked up slowly and saw him standing by a stone bench, jacket loosely draped over his arm, watching with a mixture of curiosity and something that looked dangerously like awe. Robert's steps were tentative as he approached, the man who once filled rooms now reduced to careful, deliberate movement. For a second she considered turning away, keeping the life she had built separate, safe. But the children were close and curious, and the moment had already found them whether she welcomed it or not. Robert stopped when he saw them, 3 small figures clustered like a constellation around Audra. His face went through an entire range of emotions in the space of a breath: confusion, shock, recognition, then a softening that made his jaw unclench. The resemblance hit him like a physical thing. Brianna's thoughtful stillness, Allison's wide-eyed mischief, Havy's sticky-jawed grin, they carried facets of him he had never been given the chance to know. He stepped forward as if drawn, though his feet moved as if through water. "Who are they?" he asked, voice small and unsteady in a way Audra had never heard from him before. Her heart beat hard enough to feel in her throat. For the span of a long second she considered deflecting, making some casual remark about family, friends, or cousins. Then she met his gaze and saw the raw, honest question in his eyes. No boardroom armor, no scripted replies, only the stunned vulnerability of a man suddenly faced with the consequences of a life he had chosen. "They're mine," she said simply. The words landed between them like a verdict. Robert's knees nearly gave out. The air seemed to reconfigure itself. He looked from Audra to the children and back, as if trying to stitch a picture that had been missing a large essential piece. "They're mine?" he repeated, voice breaking. The reality was heavier than any spreadsheet, louder than any public statement. 3 years of birthdays, first words, scraped knees, all moments he had never witnessed, now pressed into his chest at once. He swallowed, the enormity of lost time folding over him. Audra stayed steady, wrapping her arm protectively around Havy's small shoulders. May moved closer, a calm smile masking the tension, offering a quiet cushion in the sudden storm. Audra's voice was low but firm. "We're safe. They have a home. I raised them. That's not changing." Robert listened, the rawness of his expression shifting into something that looked like grief, edged with wonder. He took a single step forward, then paused, eyes on their faces as if seeking permission he had no right to ask for. The world had shifted in one breath, and neither of them could predict how the rest of it would fall into place. The private consultation room felt too small for what needed to be said. Audra closed the door behind them, the soft click punctuating a moment she'd spent years preparing for, yet never felt ready to face. The triplets settled on the floor with a small box of blocks May had handed them, unaware of the emotional storm thickening above their heads. Allison began stacking pieces with enthusiastic precision. Havy gnawed thoughtfully on a corner of one, and Brianna observed quietly, always the first to sense the tone of a room. Robert didn't sit. He stood near the window, one hand braced against the sill as though steadying himself against a truth that had cracked open a world he thought he understood. His eyes remained on the children, studying every small movement with a longing that made Audra's stomach tighten. After several long breaths, he finally turned to her. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question held no accusation, only sorrow. She met his gaze without flinching. "I found out after the divorce." The words were simple, but her voice carried edges softened by time and bruised memory. I thought about calling you, more than once, but back then—" She paused, selecting honesty with careful precision. "You didn't want a family with me. You barely wanted to look at me. I wasn't going to raise them in a house that measured their worth by what they could inherit." He absorbed the words with a painful, slow exhale. His expression folded inward, not angry but gutted, like someone finally seeing the full picture of a decision they can't undo. "I was scared," he admitted, "more than I ever said. Everyone had expectations, legacies to uphold. I let the pressure make choices for me." He closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't realize what I was destroying until it was gone." Audra looked down at the children. Brianna had paused her building to listen, her calm eyes shifting between her parents with a focus that made her seem older than she was. Allison continued her architectural masterpiece, blissfully unaware. Havy plopped into Audra's lap without warning, anchoring her with his small weight. "I protected them," she said softly. "Not from you, but from the life that once drowned everything we tried to build." Robert nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're beautiful." His eyes glistened, though he blinked the sheen away. "All of them." Audra felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something more complicated. "They're everything to me," she replied, his voice cracked. "And they're everything I never knew I needed." The confession hung between them, fragile as glass. She looked at him, the man she once loved deeply, the man who had broken her heart without cruelty, but with absence, with pressure, with silence. She had rebuilt herself from that pain, crafted a life centered around her children and her calling. She had found strength in distance, yet seeing him now, raw, humbled, fighting to stand steady, stirred an ache she thought she'd buried. "Are you going to try to take them from me?" she asked, the question quiet but weighted. He shook his head instantly. "No," he said, voice shaking with conviction. "Never. I would never hurt them. Or you. I've made too many mistakes to repeat them." Her breath eased slightly, though she didn't show it. The air felt different now, less sharp, more uncertain. He stepped closer, slow enough that she could step away if she chose, but she remained grounded. He glanced again at the children, at the pieces of himself living so vividly in her world. "I want to be in their lives," he said softly, "if you'll allow it." Audra didn't answer immediately. She needed a moment to weigh the enormity of what he was asking. Behind them, a small crash sounded, Allison's block tower collapsing in dramatic fashion. She gasped, then burst into delighted laughter, Havy echoing her with his own squeal. Brianna smiled faintly, resetting a few pieces with careful intention. Audra watched them, feeling both fierce and fragile at once. She turned back to Robert. "This can't be rushed," she warned. "Their stability comes first. Always." He nodded. "Then I'll move at their pace, and yours." For the first time that afternoon, her expression softened. The path ahead was long, complicated, unpredictable. But at least now, they were standing on the same ground, facing the truth rather than running from it. Between them, 3 small lives played with blocks, unaware that the foundation of their world had quietly shifted. The following afternoon, Robert arrived with a tentative quietness that made him seem almost unfamiliar. He carried no gift bags, no elaborate gestures, just a simple picture book tucked under one arm. Audra watched him from the doorway as he crossed the clinic's playroom with deliberate steps, giving the children space instead of rushing in. This restraint surprised her. The man she once knew filled space effortlessly. This version paused, waited, observed. Brianna noticed him first. She didn't run over. She simply watched, assessing him with the solemn, thoughtful gaze she reserved for new situations. Allison followed, eyes bright, drawn to the colorful book he held. Havy, being Havy, toddled straight toward him with complete trust, bumping into his leg like a tiny avalanche. Robert knelt immediately. "Hello," he said softly, unsure whether he had permission to touch the boy. Havy solved the dilemma by climbing directly into his lap. The small, clumsy embrace jolted through Robert's body like something he had been starving for without knowing it. His hands trembled as he steadied the child. Allison circled him like a curious kitten. "What's that?" she asked, pointing at the book. "A story," he replied. "I thought maybe we could read together." He looked up at Audra as if seeking confirmation. She nodded once. Not a full invitation, not a rejection, a beginning. They settled on the floor, the book opened across Robert's knees. Allison sat close enough to lean her cheek against his arm, while Havy remained lodged securely against his chest. Brianna stayed a bit apart, listening intently, her expression softening incrementally with every page. Robert read slowly, his voice warm but hesitant, like someone unsteady on a bridge they weren't sure would hold. The children hung on every detail. Even Brianna, trying to pretend she wasn't fully invested, drifted closer by inches until she could peek over his shoulder. Audra watched from a distance as an unexpected warmth filled her chest. Not longing, not regret, something quieter, something like relief, cloaked in caution. She never wanted her children to grow up feeling a void she couldn't explain, and seeing them respond to Robert, not the businessman, not the public figure, but the quietly attentive man she used to believe he could be, stirred a fragile, wavering hope. Later that day, he returned with a puzzle for them to work on together. Allison took immediate charge, handing out pieces with tiny leadership commands. Your corners, your colors, your sky, Brianna corrected her with soft expertise. Havy attempted to eat a piece, which Robert gently retrieved with a laugh that sounded foreign, even to him, loosened, genuine, unarmored. Audra noticed these small interactions accumulating into something meaningful. He never pushed, never demanded, never overstepped. Instead, he offered presence through patient acts, lifting Havy when his arms grew tired, helping Brianna align a tricky edge piece, letting Allison decorate his sleeves with sticker stars as if he were a captain in her imaginary army. By evening, the children spoke of him not with formality, but with comfortable familiarity. He reads warm, Allison declared. He ties shoelaces good, Havy added. Brianna nodded in quiet agreement. He listens. Audra's throat tightened at the comment. Listening was something Robert hadn't done enough of in the past. Yet here he was, learning to do it now, slowly, steadily, without expectation of praise. The following visit he brought nothing except time. He sat cross-legged on the rug as the children built towers, played pretend, and peppered him with questions. Audra stayed near the doorway, not intruding, letting the scene unfold. Robert met each child where they were, gentle with Brianna's introspection, amused by Allison's boundless imagination, tender with Havy's clinging affection. At one point he hesitated before asking Audra, "May I help with their afternoon snack?" The question alone stunned her. The old Robert had been accustomed to control, not permission. She studied him for a moment before nodding. He joined her in the small, clinic kitchen, washing fruit with care that made his movements look almost reverent. Their shoulders brushed once, neither pulling away. The silence between them felt different, not tense, not heavy, simply present. "You're good with them," she said quietly, slicing apples. His hand paused under the running water. "I'm trying," he answered. "I know I can't get back what I missed." Audra exhaled. "You can't, but you can be part of the days ahead." He looked at her as though those words were the first real blessing he'd received in years. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Gentle visits, quiet involvement, small moments of humor shared between adults who had once been strangers in their own marriage. Audra found herself laughing once, unexpectedly, when Havy insisted Robert wear a toy crown and present royal snacks. The sound surprised both of them, lingering in the air like something fragile and newly freed. But nothing moved too fast. Audra kept boundaries clear. She watched everything through a lens of protection. She weighed each moment carefully, not letting hope blur judgment. She accepted his presence only because he earned it through patience, consistency, and genuine attention. And Robert, once a man defined by speed, power, and pressure, learned to move slowly, to wait, to show up without expectation. When he tied Allison's shoe one afternoon and looked up at Audra with a small, grateful smile, she felt a shift, not a leap, not a surrender. A shift. Something inside her recognized the possibility of rebuilding, not through passion or promises, but through sustained care, the kind that didn't demand, the kind that didn't rush, the kind that might eventually be worthy of trust again. The evening storm swept over Rivermore in a sudden rush, turning the sky the color of bruised steel and flooding the streets with cold sheets of rain. Audra drove carefully, wipers struggling against the downpour. The children chattered in the back seat about puddles and lightning, blissfully unaware of the tension curling through their mother's shoulders. She was, already exhausted from the day's long shift, and the weather tightened her nerves even more. A sudden sputter from beneath the hood made her grip the wheel. The car shuddered, coughed, then lost power. She pulled over just in time before the engine died completely. Rain hammered against the windshield, drowning out her sigh. She tried the ignition again. No response. The triplets fell quiet, sensing the shift in her energy. "Are we stuck?" Allison asked, peering out at the rain-spattered glass. "For a bit," Audra replied calmly, masking her worry. She grabbed her phone and dialed roadside assistance. The line was jammed. She called again, busy, again. Still nothing. The storm had overwhelmed the entire city service networks. Brianna leaned forward between the seats. "Mama, it's okay," she said softly. But Audra's thoughts were racing. 3 small children, a broken-down car, a storm so heavy the road was beginning to blur. She needed help, not tomorrow, not in an hour. Now. Her contacts list stared back at her like a test she didn't want to fail. Her thumb hovered over one name she had avoided relying on for years. Then she pressed it. Robert answered on the second ring. His voice held a concern that startled her, not sharp, not commanding, but steady. "Audra, everything all right?" "My car stalled," she said, trying to sound composed. "The kids are with me. We're on Seabrook Lane. The storm." Her voice wavered in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I'm on my way," he said instantly. "No hesitation. Stay in the car. Keep them warm. I'll be there soon." She didn't even have time to protest before he hung up, already moving. The next 15 minutes stretched long, filled with rain pelting the roof like stones. Havy curled against her arm. Allison pressed her face to the window. Brianna watched the headlights passing through the storm with quiet worry. Audra kept a calm voice, steadying them with small stories and soft reassurances, but her heart thudded, imagining every possible danger the storm could bring. Then headlights cut through the darkness behind them. A large SUV pulled up, its lights casting a glow across the drenched street. Robert stepped out immediately, umbrella barely protecting him from the raging downpour. His hair and shoulders were soaked within seconds, but he didn't falter. He went straight to the driver's side door. The sight of him, a mixture of urgency and quiet determination, hit her harder than the storm itself. She rolled the window down slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked, leaning down, water dripping from his jaw. "We're fine," she managed. "Let's get you all home," he said, opening the back door with gentle care. He lifted each child into the SUV with surprising ease. Brianna held onto his collar with shy trust. Allison wrapped her arms around his neck in excitement. Havy clung to him like he had known him his whole life. He settled them carefully, making sure each buckle clicked securely before closing the door. By the time he helped Audra into the front seat, he was completely soaked, but he didn't seem to care. He only exhaled a shaky breath of relief. "You're safe now." Something in her chest loosened. The SUV hummed with warm air and soft rain against the windows as they drove. The children, cozied beneath an extra blanket Robert kept in the trunk, began to drift toward sleep. Allison murmured about how the storm made the world look like shiny water. Brianna leaned her head against her seat, studying Robert in the rearview mirror with thoughtful eyes. Havy suckled his thumb, nestled in dreamland. Audra watched Robert's hands on the wheel, steady, controlled. A few years ago, he would have filled the car with tense silence or clipped instructions, but now he checked the rearview mirror often, making sure the children were comfortable. He drove slowly, deliberately, as if nothing mattered more than the precious cargo in the back. When they reached her home, he stepped out again to carry the children one by one inside, careful not to wake them. He held Brianna as though she were made of glass. He cradled Allison with a warmth that softened the hard lines of his features. He tucked Havy against his chest with a tenderness that made Audra's breath catch. Inside the house, dim lamps cast everything in a soft glow. The storm still roared outside, but in here, the world felt hushed. Audra guided the children into their beds. When she stepped back into the living room, she found Robert standing quietly by the window, rain dripping from his coat onto the hardwood floor. His eyes were distant, full of reflection she couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to come," she said softly. He turned, expression raw. "I did." The storm outside seemed to still for a breath as they stood facing each other, their history rising between them like a tide. For the first time since the divorce, they weren't doctor and patient. They weren't CO parents finding their footing. They were two people who once shared a life and were now confronting the tender remnants of what remained. "You've built something beautiful here," he murmured, glancing toward the children's room. "A home, a family, warm, steady. Everything I should have protected when I had the chance." His voice cracked slightly at the edges. "Robert," she whispered, unsure of what came next. He stepped closer, not imposing but quietly vulnerable. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't want to rewrite the past. He swallowed. "I want to deserve a place in their lives, and yours if you'll allow it, even if it's small." She looked away, heart twisting. "It's not simple." "I know," he said softly. Silence stretched, gentle, not painful. Then she felt him near, not touching, but close enough that she felt the warmth of his presence. "You're stronger now," he said quietly. "Different, more certain. And I don't want to break that. I want to respect it." His sincerity pressed against her carefully built walls, asking nothing, offering everything. Her breath shook slightly as she stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Tonight terrified me. I know," he said. "I'm sorry you had to face it alone. And what if something like this happens again?" she whispered. "What then?" His answer came without hesitation. "Then I'll show up again, and again, until you believe I won't disappear." Her eyes closed for a moment, absorbing the promise she hadn't asked for but needed more than she'd admit. When she opened them, he was still there, steady, patient, waiting. Audra lifted her hand and placed it gently on his chest, over the heart she had repaired. He covered her hand with his own, not pulling, not pressing, just holding the moment between them. "You're still healing," she said softly. "So are you," he replied. Their foreheads touched gently, a quiet connection filled with history, pain, and something slowly growing in the spaces between. Not a rekindled romance, not forgiveness, not yet. But the first fragile step toward something new. The months that followed moved with a patient, careful rhythm. Appointments, bedtime stories, school recitals. Each small event another stitch in a fabric Audra had knitted with quiet care. Yet beneath the ordinary, an undercurrent of change ran strong. Robert's visits became part of their calendar, thoughtful and steady, a help with the science fair project, sitting in the audience at a recital, a low voice reading a sleepy story on rainy afternoons. He never grandstanded. He never tried to outrun the past. Instead, he arrived on time, with simple things, a repaired toy, a sandwich he'd made thoughtfully when he knew Audra had pulled a late shift, and slowly those moments built a different kind of trust. One evening, after a long hospital shift, Audra found a note tucked into her locker, a short sentence written in a careful hand. It read simply, "Saw the sunset and thought of you." There was no flourish, no expectation, just an offering. She stared at the paper longer than she meant to, feeling both exposed and oddly comforted. Small gestures like that began to stack up. An umbrella left by her door, a warm thermos for a night on call, a message checking in after a long surgery. Each one mattered because they were unpressured acts of consideration, the exact opposite of the grand gestures she had once feared. He was learning to show up without claim, and she was learning how, slowly, to receive. Their conversations changed too. Where once their words had been clipped, defensive, and formal, now they held a careful honesty. He admitted the practical anxieties that had led him to choose legacy over family. She confessed the nights she had spent holding their small children and wondering if she had done the right thing. There were no instant absolutions, only long exchanges where each admitted small truths and listened without interruption. In the quiet hours between hospital shifts and bedtime routines, they sorted through regrets and forged new boundaries, always returning to the central truth that the children's stability came first. One afternoon, Robert accompanied Audra to a community fundraiser where the triplets performed a short play. He sat in the back, blending into the audience until the children took the stage. Watching them move with confidence, sharing lines with proud clarity, something shifted in him. He thought of every birthday he had missed, every scraped knee he hadn't kissed, every bedtime story he had not told. The ache of absence was raw, but it was no longer a void. It was a map of what he needed to inhabit moving forward. After the performance, he brought flowers, not to impress, but because he wanted the children to learn the quiet language of attentiveness. Brienne accepted them with that thoughtful solemnity she reserved for meaningful things, and Audra felt warmth she did not name. There were tests of resolve, old expectations, family dinners threaded with judgment. A board member's offhand comment about legacy appeared at inconvenient moments, and Robert handled them differently now. When Eleanor Sanford hinted about lineage at a charity event, he recognized the tone and steered the conversation toward the charity's mission instead. Those small acts of redirection were not grand declarations, they were demonstrations of new priorities. Audra noticed these shifts, not because they were flashy, but because they were consistent. They showed a man learning to protect what mattered most to her, not to the family name. As seasons turned, moments of intimacy returned in modest forms, a shared cup of coffee before the clinic opened, a hand offered to steady a wobbly step as they left an icy parking lot, a quiet smile across a staff meeting when a joke loosened the tension. Neither of them rushed. They framed each step as practical, not romantic. A hand held to help a child down from a chair, an embrace shared in the doorway after a long day. Still, these small acts accumulated into something steadier. Audra found herself laughing in ways she hadn't in years, and Robert discovered that consistency could be its own confession. One clear night, after the triplets fell asleep and the house settled into soft breathing, Audra and Robert stood on the porch for a long while, wrapped in blankets against the chill. No grand words were exchanged. Only an honest, gentle conversation about what it meant to keep promises and how to rebuild trust one day at a time. He admitted, with the humility that felt earned, that he had once been afraid to choose love because he feared failing at legacy. She admitted that she had been afraid to trust again because love had once been traded for duty. Their foreheads touched briefly, a quiet, mutual recognition of the miles they had walked to arrive here. It was not the end of their story, but it was the beginning of a new chapter, one shaped by presence, patience, and the deliberate work of becoming a family on different terms. The triplets' 4th birthday arrived like a sunlit promise, balloons bobbing, a backyard strung with lights, laughter bubbling over like music. Friends and neighbors gathered, but the afternoon belonged to 3 small rulers of a world built around cookies, games, and the slow wonder of being adored. Audra stood to the side, watching them move through the celebration with the easy confidence of children who had always been cared for. Robert remained nearby, quieter than the other fathers, hands folded, a gentle smile on his face as he handed out paper crowns and fetched juice boxes without fanfare. Seeing him there, present, steady, unfinished but trying, felt like a small miracle she hadn't allowed herself to hope for. They worked together that day as a family without grand declarations. Robert helped set up chairs, tied streamers when a gust threatened the decorations, and later, when the cake was carried out, he crouched so Brianna could whisper a secret plan for the wish she would make. The children loved him in the uncomplicated way children love, with immediate acceptance when kindness is offered, and with quick forgiveness when small mistakes happen. Audra watched those moments stitch into the fabric of the afternoon, feeling warmth and caution braided tightly together. The scenes were simple, domestic, and in their simplicity lay a profound change, the beginning of a life rebuilt by choice rather than obligation. After the party, as cups were cleared and the last paper plate folded into the trash, Audra and Robert sat on the porch steps, the evening air soft and calm. No speeches were necessary. Conversation moved in the comfortable, practical rhythm they had learned to use. Brief check-ins about schedules, plans for shared pickups, an agreement on how holidays would be arranged. They spoke of the children's small triumphs and of ordinary matters that together felt like the scaffolding of something lasting. When he reached across to hand her a stray napkin, their fingers brushed, a contact now familiar and without pressure. It was a touch that carried less of the past and more of a tender steadiness. In the quiet that followed, Audra reflected on how far they had come. Rebuilding had not been a single climactic moment, but 1,000 small choices showing up when it mattered, listening without defending, prioritizing the children's well-being over pride. She thought about the night she had spent alone with the babies, the long shifts that had tempered her patience, and the courage it had taken to protect them by herself. She also thought about Robert's slow, steady work, his willingness to be present without claiming the center of their lives. Neither path erased the other. Both had shaped the family that now sat, peaceful and full, on her porch. They faced tests along the way, family gatherings that required firm boundaries, old acquaintances who assumed entitlement, and moments when the past still threatened to pull them backward. When such tensions rose, they handled them in the new way they'd chosen, together but cautiously, with clear expectations and mutual respect. Audra insisted on transparency when it mattered. Robert learned to check his instincts to control or rescue. In public, he deflected questions about heirs and legacy and redirected conversations toward charity, community, and the children's school. These small acts of protection mattered as much as any apology could have because they showed a realignment of priorities. Over time, the meaning of legacy changed in Robert's mind. He began to understand that the most enduring gifts he could leave were not titles, possessions, or a named chair in some building, but the steady presence of love, the time invested in late-night stories, the humble and attentive work of being a parent who listens. He learned to measure success not by balance sheets, but by the quiet mornings when a child curled into his lap and fell asleep in the crook of his arm. Those moments became the metric that guided many of his choices thereafter. Wealth, once the axis of his decisions, softened into the background. What mattered most was learning how to be the man his children deserved. Audra watched his change with a guarded joy. She never forgot what had happened, nor did she romanticize the past. But the daily evidence of his effort, showing up for recitals, learning their favorite songs, asking about small details in their lives, began to build trust in a way that words could not. Forgiveness arrived slowly, in stages, first as a willingness to accept help, then as the absence of constant suspicion, then as an openness to imagine a future where they all belong to one another in a healthier way. The process was never linear. There were setbacks and days when old fears resurfaced. Still, each careful step forward counted. On an evening months later, when the yard emptied and the lights were put away, Audra and Robert sat with 3 sleeping heads inside and a quiet house around them. They spoke softly about meaning and mistakes, about how children teach adults to become better versions of themselves simply by needing them. Robert admitted, with a clarity that steadied Audra, that he would spend the rest of his life making choices that honored them, rather than the weight of an old expectation. She accepted the promise, not as a surrender, but as a pact grounded in mutual responsibility. The lesson that settled between them was simple and true. Legacy is not determined by inheritance or power. It is shaped by love, patience, and the small, consistent acts that keep a family whole. They had learned, painfully and honestly, that healing required time, humility, and a willingness to put others first. In the quiet that followed, wrapped in blankets and the contented silence of sleeping children, they allowed themselves a small shared hope that this new chapter, built on presence and practice, could hold what the past had not. When the last guest left the birthday celebration, the backyard became a quiet landscape lit only by the soft glow of string lights. The house smelled of frosting and warm laughter. Inside, the children had collapsed into sleep. Brianna curled neatly, Allison sprawled like she'd claimed the entire bed, and Havy clutching a balloon string even in dreams. Audra stood for a moment in the hallway, watching the rise and fall of their breaths, feeling a peace she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. Today had been simple, joyful, warm. And yet, beneath the calm, she felt something shift, gentle, not urgent, but unmistakable. She stepped outside to gather the last scattered toys, only to find Robert already there, sleeves rolled, collecting paper cups into a neat stack. He looked back at her with a small smile, the kind not meant to impress, but simply to exist. It struck her then how different he seemed, not from the man she once married, but from the man she divorced. The edges had softened, the quiet had deepened, the presence was steadier. He worked silently beside her, not invading her space yet matching her rhythm. A part of her that had been guarded for years recognized the sincerity in his movements. As they walked back toward the porch, the night air wrapped around them with a gentleness that made the moment feel suspended. The lawn, littered with confetti stars, looked like a sky turned upside down. Audra sank onto the porch step, and Robert joined her without assumption. Between them was an ease carved from months of slow rebuilding. It wasn't romantic in the conventional sense. It was calmer, rooted not in sparks but in earned understanding. For the first time in years, she didn't brace herself when he was near. She simply breathed. He glanced at the house, then at her. "They're happy," he said softly, as though afraid to break the quiet. "They are," she replied, warmth filling her voice. "They feel safe." He exhaled in a way that carried both relief and longing. "That's because of you." Audra didn't argue. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to discount the truth of her own effort. Still, she tilted her head slightly. "You're part of that now." The word surprised both of them. They settled in the space between with a weight that felt hopeful rather than heavy. Robert didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat with the statement, absorbing its meaning like a vow he hadn't expected but deeply wanted. A soft wind rustled the trees. Audra leaned back on her hands, looking up at the sky. "Life didn't go the way I imagined," she admitted, "but maybe it went the way it needed to." Robert watched her profile in the dim light, regret and gratitude mingling in his eyes. "I wish I could change the past," he whispered. "You can't," she answered, turning to meet his gaze, "but you can honor what comes next. That's what matters." He nodded slowly. "I intend to." Their children had reshaped decisions neither of them expected to face. Through their innocence, they had created a space where past failures could be acknowledged without defining the future. They had softened the hard truths, offering both parents a chance to choose differently, not for themselves, but for the small lives depending on them to get it right this time. Later that evening, Brianna wandered sleepily into the living room, blanket trailing behind her. "Mama," she murmured, rubbing her eyes, "are we a happy family now?" Audra lifted her into her lap, holding her close. She didn't rush to answer. She glanced toward Robert, who stood quietly in the doorway, the expression on his face open and gentle. "Yes," Audra said finally, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "We are." Brianna nodded, content, and drifted back to sleep with a tiny sigh. Audra carried her to bed, tucked her in, then returned to the porch where Robert waited, the faintest shimmer of emotion in his eyes. They didn't speak right away. No grand declaration was needed. Instead, Robert lifted a light blanket draped over the chair and settled it around her shoulders in a gesture so instinctive and gentle it caught her breath. "You deserve peace," he said quietly, "and I want to help you keep it." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a promise laced with fear. It was simply the truth of a man who had learned, painfully and patiently, that love without humility has no foundation, and a woman who had learned, through years of quiet resilience, that healing sometimes grows from the most unexpected soil. She looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time since their lives diverged, she saw not the shadow of the man who hurt her, but the man willing to grow beyond who he had been. Their hands didn't reach for each other that night. They didn't need to. They shared something steadier, the recognition that families aren't defined by perfection or by the smoothness of their history. They're shaped by the willingness to show up, to choose compassion over pride, to rebuild with care instead of haste. As the night deepened and the house settled into quiet sleep, Audra felt a calm certainty she hadn't known in years. She realized their story held a lesson, one she wanted her children, and anyone listening, to understand someday. Sometimes life breaks you open, so you can rebuild yourself with clearer eyes. Sometimes the people who hurt you are capable of growth, if given space and held to truth. Sometimes love returns not as a spark, but as a steady flame, quiet, warm, deliberate. And sometimes the family you build after the pain becomes stronger than the one that fell apart. Audra leaned her head back, letting the silence settle comfortably between her and Robert. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't bracing for loss. She was allowing the possibility of something real to grow, not a second chance at their old life, but the first chance at a better one.